Hi there and welcome back to Dodge Miniature Painting. Now we're going to begin to remove some of the parts of the Thunderhawk from the resin gates. In order to do this, we're going to need some of the tools that we used in the previous episode. So we're going to be using our large gauge clippers, our Citadel clippers, and we're most likely going to be using our razor saw as well. First off, we will use the Citadel clippers to clip right down near the end of the gate. It's going to need a firm press, and we're going to cut through the end of that run. As you can see, there's quite a sudden ping as it goes through, and it's also, because of the brittle nature of the resin, remove the next gate at the same time, something really we want to try to avoid. Here I'm using the larger scale clippers, and we can see in fact the pressure of those large clippers causes the entire gate to ping off. Not really desirable. Really we want to be taking the gates off in a more controlled fashion. So moving on, that's a point to note. So we are left with these two runs at the end that we now need to clean up. As you can see, they're at about a 45-degree angle. So we take our Citadel clippers again, and we just start clipping off in gradually smaller and smaller chunks as we work our way down towards the main body of the piece that we're working on. Changing the angle of the cutters, we can see the relatively brittle nature of the resin there as it pings off. We don't want to go right to the very edge because there is a danger that we could damage the main part of the model. As we can see, we're left with a small nub of resin that we can move on and clean up afterwards. Removing more pieces where the gate contact the miniature. Don't know why I call this a miniature, it's a massive-ture really. And again, we do the same process on the other run. Here we're taking a special care to make sure that the part of the gate that we're running doesn't interfere with the main block of resin, making sure we're not doing any damage that we might then have to go back and repair. And again, taking off as much of the material here as we can do without risk of damaging the part. I'm always moving the miniature around to make sure I've got the best angle with the clippers to take off the piece of resin that I'm looking to clear. So we can see that most of those runs have now been removed using the clippers. Now we need to remove much smaller amounts of material, and for that we're going to be moving to our hobby knife. I've just turned the desk lamp on there to give myself better visibility as it gets into the evening. So we're using a good sharp hobby knife here. You can see even with this is a fresh blade, I'm still having to do a little bit of work, but not too much. I'm trying to let the sharpness of the blade do most of the work for me. And we're basically trying to take that knife flat along the model and clean up the join as flat as we can do. This one I found a little bit awkward, being a righty, so we have to reverse the blade over and then cut away from us. We're which is, to be honest, safer as the blade is moving away from you, but not always possible. I'm now moving the miniature onto its side, so I can then use the straight of the side to cut down and get as flush and clean line as possible. Okay, so now we have a relatively flat surface. Just getting the camera to focus there. We can see the edges are still a bit rough, but we've taken most of that gate off and we've preserved the angle of the piece that we're working on, and we haven't done any untoward damage. So onto a sanding stick now. And just with light motion, I'm just sanding off the edge there, removing the last parts of the gate, making sure I've got a nice smooth finish. Using a relatively coarse grain here, this part isn't going to be visible, so I don't need to worry about being an absolute mirror finish. What I'm basically trying to do is give myself a good flat surface that when we work on to attach it to the next part, we're going to have a nice clean edge. Here I'm just using an old GW tank brush, I think this was, and I'm just using this to clean the resin dust off as I'm working. Just helps me see where I'm working and helps clean any debris off. Now we've removed the gate, we can see that we have a fairly large amount of flash around the exit of the Thunderhawk ramp. This is where, as resin is fed into the silicone mould, it bleeds a little bit in between the seams. It's a perfectly normal process, and you see this on all types of plastic kits. However, of course, we do need to remove this. So immediately we can take the worst of it off. Again, I'm using the angles of the model to help me here. I'm cutting parallel to straight edges and letting the sharpness of the knife do the work rather than trying to press through the flash. If you try to do this with a blunt knife, you may find you exert too much pressure and you may then damage the model as the knife slips and gouges into the resin. Now going to speed the clip up a little bit as we begin to go and clean through all of this flash around the inside where the ramp is going to sit up against. Some parts of the interior are quite awkward to work on. It feels tricky to get the right angle with a knife, so you have to improvise and find which angle works best. And now we move on to the ramp. Again, we have 3 gates that need to be removed. And we're just going to take those off with the GW snips. As we saw earlier, these tend to work better than the heavier gauge pliers on gates of this size. And again, we're going to trim them down progressively smaller until we're left with just the smallest amount of resin that we can do from the gate. And again, using the hobby knife, just to clean those off. Okay, and now we can sand off that contact point so we've got a nice smooth finish, clean it up, and this is our ramp. So now we're going to start dry fitting that ramp in to see what the fit is like, and straight away we can see that we've got too much material somewhere. So we start to examine the model, look at where the contact points are that shouldn't be there, and gradually, in slow, small pieces, begin to move that off. Trimming some of the material from the inside that might be interfering. And again, trying to get a sanding stick in there to clean that material out from the inside. You can see me just scoring tiny pieces of resin off of the inside there, just so they ping off and give me a nice clean line. At all times I'm trying to run that hobby knife parallel to the surface in order to avoid gouging. But we can see, although it's a little bit better, we still have a problem with the fit here, so we're going to need to look at where we need to move more material. You'll find as you work with the Forge World kits, particularly the larger kits, the tanks, and certainly this is going to be the case with the Thunderhawk Gunship, that it's going to be a degree of removing material, retrying your test fit, and add and repeat. Don't forget that it is easy to take material off, but much harder to put material back on. So you always want to try small increments of removing material and then doing another dry fit. If you take too much off, then you may have to be looking at filling or building up a part of a model where you might have accidentally caused a larger gap than you intended. Here I'm just trimming the fit of the edge interlocking sections, and they're starting to look about right. I can see that I've got too much material at the top of the ramp that's butting into the top of the space. Dry fitting is an essential part of building a large Forge World resin model. The parts, as I mentioned previously, have a tendency to warp as they cure, and therefore you're going to need to keep fitting the model together. Here you see me just checking that I have a straight line using the grids of my cutting mat. They're a very useful, very quick guide to make sure that the surface that you have been working on is still straight. But dry fitting is an essential part of this process. Make sure that you check, double check, and then triple check again that the piece you're working on fits correctly before you go anywhere near some glue. Here I'm using a metal ruler just to check the straightness of the top part, and I've found that the part is a little bit bowed, and that is going to affect my fit. I'm going to work with the door as much as possible to take that into account, bearing in mind that I'm going to have to heat the top part in order to straighten that fit out, and that's going to affect my dry fit. Therefore, I made the decision that as long as the door fitted snugly, if there was a small line at the top there, I intended to magnetise the door in place so it could be open or closed, and that's not going to cause me too much of a problem. We're getting there now. We can see that the edge pieces are just about right, but the top of the door is still too wide. So I'm removing small pieces of material each time with the sanding sponge and checking the dry fit at each time. This may feel like a slow process, but it is essential with these kits to make sure that you get the best possible fit. Here, where I've been working with the sanding sponge, I have given myself a slightly beveled edge, which I'm just straightening up with the hobby knife. Now I've switched to a heavier gauge file as I've realised I need to take off a bit more material from the inside of the ramp to create a chamfered edge. And we can see we're starting to get there now. The door is starting to fit in, however the fit is still too tight. We want the ramp to have some degree of resistance when it opens and closes, so it doesn't just flop around. But at the same time, if the door is too tight, then our paint job is going to be compromised as we use the model. So, the ramp now fits into place and pushes the roof up into what would be a straight alignment, which we will make more permanent with a hairdryer at a later point. However, it is still an extremely firm fit. So now I'm just taking small amounts off using the sanding sponge, the sanding stick, and testing my dry fit each time. We're almost there at this point. It's worth noting this video is going to come in at around 20 minutes long. I'm hoping that you find this a useful and informative 20 minutes, especially if you are a beginner at these types of kits, and that you find this gradual process very illustrative as to the best way of putting these models together. In terms of actual amount of time taken, if we factor out the sped up clips, I spent about 45 minutes on this single part alone. That includes the time to remove the gates, remove the runs, clean those up, and then sanding and fitting. So as we can see, 45 minutes just getting these two parts to a good point. We can begin to see the amount of time that it's going to take to complete this model. On the desk there you can see the resin dust that has been produced from constant sanding and filing. This is why I mentioned in the first advert that a respirator mask, or at the very least a dust mask, is going to help protect your lungs whilst working with resin. Again, just using a metal ruler just to check I've got a straight edge, and my old GW tank brush just to clean up that dust off the model as I'm working with it. We're getting into finer and finer corrections of the fit now, taking care not to remove too much material and making sure again we're happy with the dry fit. So there we go. I hope you found this useful. I hope you found this interesting. I know this is a long video, but if you are a beginner working with these kits, I hope you found the information and just going through this process of fitting this part to be helpful as you work on your first Forge World kit. Thank you.